My name is Gloria Hart, 32 years old. From the curb, our suburban Boston house always looked like a postcard. White trim sharpened every corner, hydrangeas puffed like meringue along the walk, a swing set in the backyard that squeaked a lullaby at dusk. Inside, though, the air carried a different tune, one where the melody ran on my sister Audrey's name, and I learned, early, to live on the harmony. 2 years older, she was the child whose firsts filled entire albums. First steps, first tutu, first solo, in a lavender leotard under cafeteria lights. My milestones collected dust in the back of her binder, a couple of crooked photos paper-clipped together like a receipt someone meant to file and forgot. It wasn't one big slight, it was paper cuts. Audrey's dance recitals were rituals. Mom bought roses and Dad filmed from the front row, hands steady, voice proud in the background. That's my girl. When I won the state science fair at 12, an orrery that actually moved, the ceremony conflicted with a dance competition. They left a smiley face note by the toaster. We're so proud of you. Leftover lasagna in the fridge. My certificate curled in a drawer until the corners went soft. Christmas held its own sermon. Audrey unwrapped things with words like sapphire and white gold attached, her eyes matching the glint at her throat. I got a boxed set about famous scientists, which I did read, dog-earing pages and copying down equations. It wasn't the book that hurt, it was the rule the gift announced without saying it. Audrey deserves beautiful. Gloria, be useful. Even our mistakes were graded on a curve. When Audrey broke curfew, there were cups of tea and, let's talk this through. When I did the same, there were grounded weekends, a list of chores taped to my door, and a lecture on trust. Rooms told the truth louder than anyone. Audrey's walls transformed with each season of her becoming. Ballerinas to pop idols to a plush teen sanctuary with a window seat and a vanity that made her skin glow. My room grew old with me, a pale yellow that didn't match anything I felt past 5th grade, furniture that never moved because no one asked it to. When I suggested dark blue in 8th grade, Mom sighed about budgets and priorities. 2 weeks later, Audrey's room turned into a magazine spread. By then I was fluent in a language I hadn't wanted to learn, the calculus of belonging. If I stacked my report cards with straight A's, maybe I'd buy a seat at the table. If I joined every academic club, if I came home with ribbons from math contests and a teacher's note that said exceptional, perhaps the camera would find me, just once. The camera never did. That's nice, Mom would say over the sink, her hands in suds. But don't you want to try something fun like your sister? The fun I found was competence. I taught myself to cook, learned bus schedules by heart, made charts in a spiral notebook so I wouldn't forget a single homework due date. You're so independent, Dad would remark, which was a compliment that felt suspiciously like permission to overlook me. The one person who watched me the way you watch a sunrise, quietly, fully, as if it changed something in you, was Dad's mother, Elizabeth. Grandma Liz had the steadiness of ledger lines and hands that smelled like cinnamon. She'd lived a life that required grit and exactness, an accountant in an era that didn't make room for women to be both. I sat in her kitchen every Thursday after school, the clock ticking, the radio murmuring old songs. One afternoon at 15, she asked if I knew what compound interest was. When I shook my head, she pulled out a legal pad and drew the magic curve that grows slow and then all at once. The boring things, done consistently, turn into miracles, she said, sliding the pen to me. My chest lit, like someone had handed me the blueprint out of invisibility. High school graduation arrived with heat shimmering off the practice field and an honor cord scratching my neck. I gave a valedictorian speech about orbits and momentum, about how small forces over time alter trajectories. Out on the grass, Dad held the camcorder. Later, when I watched the tape, the lens lingered on Audrey's expressions. Bored, then animated when someone cracked a joke, while my voice frothed into wind. The party afterward turned into a briefing about Audrey's acceptance to an expensive private college. It's such a perfect fit for her, Mom repeated, glowing with purpose. When an aunt asked about my scholarship, she smiled, relieved rather than proud. Gloria's practical. She'll be fine. Being fine is not the same as being seen. That night, I lay in my unchanged yellow room and formed the kind of vow that tastes metallic on the tongue. I would build a life so undeniable that even a camera pointed the wrong way would still catch its light. It wasn't about money yet. It was about gravity. I wanted my own. College split our family narrative like a forked river. Audrey moved into a dorm room my parents furnished like a boutique hotel, matching bedding, mini fridge, fairy lights braided into a headboard, while they drove 6 hours to help her settle, then stayed the weekend. My departure resembled a luggage drop. Dad carried a box up 3 flights, glanced at the time, and said, "You've got this," as if encouragement were a handoff. I took 2 jobs that first semester and added a third by finals, pouring coffee at dawn, shelving books on Sundays, tutoring stats in between. When I called home, the updates I received were about Audrey's roommate drama and her sorority's philanthropy gala. When I mentioned my 4.0 after midterms, Mom said, "Of course you do, honey," and told me Audrey was thinking about taking up Pilates. It might have hollowed me out, all that dismissal, if not for the relief of finding adults who recognized the shape of my mind. Professor Lambert of financial analysis stopped me after class, tapping a finger against my test. "You don't just compute," he said. "You see?" He began sliding opportunities across the table, coffee chats with analysts, a coveted internship lead, the kind of advice that collapses years into months. I filed each blessing with Grandma Liz's lessons in the mental cabinet labeled "Proof that I am real." Back home, the shrine in the living room kept expanding. Audrey in soft focus on stage, Audrey on vacation, Audrey at the beach with friends whose names my mother recited like relatives. My picture on the side table remained a kindergarten portrait where my hair was cut blunt and crooked because I'd tried to fix it myself. Sometimes I'd pass that photo and touch the glass and think, hold on. Not because anyone was pulling me, but because I needed the reminder to pull myself. By 13, I had learned something adults like to tell kids and rarely model. Approval cannot be the engine. I sharpened quiet weapons, curiosity, discipline, and appetite for late nights alone with problems that gave way if you asked the right question. The world felt like a lock, and no one was going to hand me a key. Good. I wanted to learn how to pick. But if this sounds like a straight line toward triumph, it wasn't. There were evenings I pressed my ear to the wall between our rooms and listened to my parents praising Audrey for being so poised, so sparkling, and felt my chest flood with a shame I couldn't name. There were mornings I skipped breakfast to save money, and afternoons I sat in the library to avoid going home to another surprise makeover for Audrey's space. In all that ache, I trained myself to disappear on command. You can become brilliant at vanishing. It is not a skill you should keep forever. Years later, people would tell me they admired my restraint when I finally told the truth, as if patience were a virtue and not a survival tactic. They didn't see the way I'd had to split myself to fit the rooms I was given. They didn't see how early my feet learned to curl over the edges of things. The day I turned 16, I spent my birthday money on a used graphing calculator and a bus ticket to the city to visit a science museum. Audrey got a surprise party with a tiered cake and a necklace that flashed when she blew out candles. I took pictures of a meteorite and sat on a bench with my museum map folded like a treasure. On the ride home, streetlights smeared into gold, and I thought, if the universe is this wide, surely there's space for me. I am telling you all of this because you need to understand that what happened later did not begin at a Thanksgiving table with a gift and a search bar. It began here, with a girl who made her own gravity and promised herself something dangerous and holy, that the day would come when no one could pretend not to see her. I didn't know yet what it would cost, only that I would pay it. And there, tucked between resolve and ache, a shadow moved, the first hint that being undeniable would expose more than I imagined, not just in me, but in everyone who had once looked away. By the time I was 17, I had already stopped waiting for applause. I had built my life around the rhythm of self-sufficiency, packing my own lunches, catching rides to competitions, ironing my own shirts before debate tournaments. Audrey still slept in until noon on weekends, confident that breakfast would be warm and waiting. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me, or at least I don't think it was. It was that their love translated into caretaking for Audrey and into expectation for me. They assumed I'd manage, so I did. What they never guessed was how much I'd already learned about managing. Every Thursday evening in Grandma Liz's kitchen, the smell of nutmeg in the air, I learned a new way to see the world. One week it was compound interest, another it was how to balance risk against reward. She showed me how her paycheck as an accountant had stretched through discipline, how small sacrifices stacked like bricks until they became a wall of security. True wealth, she told me once, pressing a cookie into my hand, isn't about showing people what you have. It's about knowing you'll be all right, no matter what storm comes. That sentence stayed with me. When I stood on stage as valedictorian, the tassel slapping my cheek in the wind, I spoke about momentum, the way even the smallest push could alter a planet's course if it happened at the right time. I looked out into the audience, scanning the rows of folding chairs. Dad had the camcorder tilted at Audrey again, catching her sighs, her eye rolls, the way she flipped her hair in boredom. When the recording surfaced later, there was barely 10 seconds of my speech. I had talked about the universe, about small forces changing destiny, and my own family missed it. At the graduation party, the room hummed with conversation about Audrey's acceptance into Westfield University, the private school with tuition that could have paid for our entire house twice over. People clustered around her, asking about dorm themes, sororities, her plans to study communications. When someone turned to me with a half-hearted smile and said, "And you? Where are you headed?" I answered, "State University, full scholarship, business program." Mom chimed in quickly, "That's nice. Gloria's always practical." Then she passed around more hors d'oeuvres. Practical. A word meant to praise, but it cut like dismissal. That night, I made a promise to myself, one I repeated under my breath like scripture. Someday, I'll build something so undeniable they'll be forced to see me. College life split us further apart. Audrey moved into her dorm with coordinated everything. Rose gold desk lamp, matching comforter sets, a fridge stocked with snacks my parents drove 6 hours to deliver. They stayed the whole weekend, taking pictures, helping her hang posters, even meeting her roommate's parents. For my move, Dad drove me to campus in 20 minutes flat, dropped off 2 suitcases and a box of thrift store supplies, and said, "You'll figure it out. Call if you absolutely need something." I waved goodbye with one hand still clutching my pillow, the other gripping a notebook where I'd written my budget in careful columns. The first semester, I learned exhaustion could become a way of life. Morning shifts at the coffee shop left my clothes smelling like burnt espresso. Afternoons in the library paid barely enough to cover groceries. Tutoring freshmen in economics at night kept me upright with caffeine and stubbornness. I worked, studied, and slept in rotating fragments, yet I held my GPA at a perfect 4.0. When I called home to tell Mom, her response was, "That's nice, honey. Did I tell you Audrey got invited to the best sorority? She's already making so many friends." I bit my tongue, said congratulations for my sister, and hung up. If not for Professor Lambert, I might have drowned in the fatigue of it all. He caught me after class one day, leaning against his desk with a look of rare interest. "Gloria, I've been teaching financial analysis for 25 years. You see patterns most people can't. Have you thought about where you want to take this gift?" His question cracked something open inside me. He started sending opportunities my way. An introduction to a hedge fund analyst, an invitation to a guest lecture on Wall Street trends, even a recommendation letter for a summer internship. Meanwhile, Audrey spent her summer backpacking through Europe, her Instagram crowded with cappuccinos in Paris and sunsets in Santorini. When she got home, my parents held a welcome-back dinner, complete with balloons. When I returned from my internship at Maxwell Investments, exhausted, exhilarated, my mind buzzing with stock tickers and strategy sessions, I came back to silence. No dinner, no balloons. Just a voicemail from Mom reminding me to water the plants. Then came the day the world tilted. It was the fall of my junior year when Grandma Liz died suddenly of a stroke. The funeral was a blur of lilies and whispered condolences, but what gutted me most was the silence afterward. She had been my compass, the one adult who leaned forward when I spoke instead of away. Without her, I felt like I'd been cut loose in orbit, spinning without gravity. A month later, a letter arrived from her attorney. She had left me $50,000, her entire life savings. My parents were stunned. Over dinner, Dad suggested gently, "Maybe you should share with Audrey. She's thinking about grad school, and that money could really help." Mom added, "Families should support each other. You always manage just fine on your own." I looked at them both and, for the first time in my life, said no. Grandma left this to me. She believed in my goals, and I'll honor that. I invested every cent. I can still see myself at my tiny desk, stacks of financial reports beside me, Grandma's voice in my head. True wealth isn't flashy. That inheritance became the seed that sprouted into everything I have now. By the time I graduated, I was no longer the overlooked daughter in a yellow bedroom. I was someone who carried a secret weapon: knowledge, discipline, and a growing hunger to prove that invisibility had never meant insignificance. And I wasn't done. After graduation, I stepped into Manhattan with 2 suitcases, a second-hand blazer, and a job at Blackstone Financial. My salary was modest by city standards, barely enough to cover a shoebox studio I shared with 3 roommates. Still, I carried myself like the skyscrapers I walked beneath, rigid, unyielding, pointing higher than the clouds. Every paycheck, I saved half. I skipped dinners out, wore the same heels until the soles thinned, and lived on tuna and ramen when rent climbed. It wasn't sacrifice, it was strategy. Every dollar was a soldier, and I was building an army. Blackstone taught me 2 things: how to spot an opportunity everyone else overlooked, and how little the world expects of a young woman with sharp eyes and sharper numbers. Men in suits twice my age underestimated me, sometimes forgetting my name mid-sentence, but I let them. Underestimation is camouflage. In meetings, I scribbled notes no one asked for, then stayed late analyzing the data they ignored. When one of my predictions hit, a small energy stock rebounding after an overreaction, the senior partner took the credit. I smiled, tucked away the lesson, and thought, one day, I won't be here to be overlooked. By 26, I had enough saved to risk everything. I left Blackstone with a handful of contacts, a laptop that wheezed when I opened too many spreadsheets, and an idea for a firm. I named it TW Strategic Partners, letters neutral enough to avoid suspicion, initials no one would connect to me. At first, it was just me in a cramped sublet with a desk pushed against a window that overlooked a fire escape. I scoured markets for undervalued companies, the kind everyone else dismissed. My first big win came from a biotech startup run by 2 women in their 30s. Their diagnostic tool was revolutionary, but no one took them seriously. I poured nearly everything into it. A year later, the company was acquired, and my investment multiplied tenfold. Overnight, I crossed the $1 million threshold. I didn't celebrate. I didn't buy champagne or designer clothes. I bought more stocks. Meanwhile, my family remained oblivious. Audrey bounced between marketing jobs, each new role celebrated as if she'd been appointed CEO of the universe. Mom and Dad praised her creativity, her networking skills, her ability to light up a room. When relatives asked about me, the questions were polite but shallow. "Are you dating anyone yet? Still doing the finance thing?" When I hinted at my company, Mom would wave it off. "Well, as long as you're stable. Not everyone needs to be ambitious." What they didn't know was that ambition was burning me alive. By 27, my net worth had doubled. By 28, tripled. Each decision built momentum: renewable energy storage before policy shifts made it explode, obscure tech companies bought by giants months later. My algorithms identified patterns others missed, and soon I was managing millions for clients who barely believed I was old enough to vote. Still, when I drove home for Christmas, I borrowed a Toyota instead of bringing my Tesla. I wore simple sweaters instead of the couture dresses I wore at investor galas. I gave my parents kitchen gadgets under $50 while my colleagues gifted diamond watches. I told myself it was easier this way, easier to be invisible than to explain why I wasn't. Because I knew the truth: if my family learned what I had, it wouldn't make them proud. It would make them hungry. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. By the time I turned 30, the numbers had begun to look unreal even to me. My firm had grown from a one-woman operation into a boutique company with a dozen employees and over $200 million under management. My personal net worth crossed the $5 million mark before I'd even realized it, then tripled again by the time I was 32. $15 million. enough to buy the kind of houses I used to walk past in Boston, staring up at glowing windows like they contained another species of life. But I never became flashy. I kept Grandma Liz's voice in my ear. True wealth isn't flashy. I lived in a sleek Manhattan apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, but when I went home, I tied my hair back in a ponytail, wore jeans from discount racks, and drove rentals that blended into the driveway. To my family, I was still just Gloria with a boring finance job. They liked it that way. And, if I was honest, so did I. Pretending was easier than watching their eyes light up only when they smelled money. Audrey, meanwhile, stumbled from job to job, never quite failing because Mom and Dad refused to let her. They co-signed leases, sent checks for credit card debt, even helped her finance a brand new Audi at 34. Every time I visited, the living room mantel overflowed with pictures of her vacations and promotions, while my face appeared only in a crooked photo from high school, tucked beside a candle as if by accident. I stopped trying to correct the imbalance. Instead, I created two versions of myself. The family Gloria, who answered their questions with vague phrases like steady work and good benefits, and the real Gloria, who signed contracts in boardrooms, appeared in glossy magazine profiles, and dined with people who saw me not as a background figure, but as a storm. It worked until Michael came along. We met at a gallery opening of all places. He was an architect with ink-stained fingers, and a mind that moved like blueprints, precise, daring, always reaching upward. Our first date lasted 6 hours. By the third, he already suspected I was hiding something. "Why do you downplay what you do?" he asked one night, after I'd brushed off a phone call that had involved 7 figures and an acquisition deal. I lied automatically. "They're not interested in finance." But he saw through me. "Gloria, you're one of the most successful people I know. You're managing hundreds of millions, and you just told your mother you had a quiet day checking spreadsheets." His words lodged like a splinter. I told him the truth. The photo albums, the yellow bedroom, the invisible graduation speech, the vow whispered into my pillow. He listened without interruption, then asked softly, "Don't you want to live as your whole self, even with them?" For weeks that question gnawed at me. By the time Thanksgiving approached, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to stage some dramatic announcement, but I was done shrinking. I'd bring Michael home, wear clothes I actually liked, answer questions honestly if they asked, and as a gesture, small but significant, I bought my parents a new television, a sleek smart model to replace their ancient box that flickered like candlelight. It wasn't extravagant for me, but it was far more than they'd ever expect from the practical daughter. As we packed the car for the drive to Boston, Michael caught my hesitation. "You don't owe them a performance," he said. "I know," I replied, staring at the silver-wrapped box in the back seat, "but maybe I owe myself the truth." The highway stretched ahead, long and gray, the kind of road that feels like it's leading you not just home, but into a reckoning you can't avoid. The highway unwound beneath us, mile after mile of gray ribbon stitched through November woods stripped bare. Michael drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally brushing mine, a quiet reassurance. I stared at the silver-wrapped television box in the back seat as though it were ticking. It wasn't just a gift, it was a declaration, small but deliberate. I was done pretending. When we pulled into my parents' street, Audrey's Audi gleamed in the driveway, its paint catching the late afternoon sun like a spotlight. Of course, she never missed an entrance. My chest tightened, old reflexes firing. Michael caught my look and murmured, "Showtime?" I gave a dry laugh, something like that. The front door swung open before we knocked. Mom rushed forward, arms outstretched, not for me, but for Michael. "You must be the architect. Gloria's told us so much." She beamed, guiding him in by the arm. Dad gave me a distracted pat on the shoulder, already calling out, "Audrey, your sister's here." Audrey appeared moments later, poised like a performer stepping onto stage. Her hair was freshly highlighted, her dress sharp enough for a boardroom, though I knew she'd only worn it for the dining room. She hugged me quickly, perfunctory, then turned her full wattage on Michael. "So, you're the famous architect. Mom says your firm's doing incredible projects. Museums, right?" She tilted her head, approving. Impressive. I stood there, suddenly invisible again, a ghost in my own childhood home. The living room confirmed it. Every surface groaned under the weight of Audrey's framed photos. Her wedding in Hawaii, her trip to Italy, her dog dressed in holiday sweaters. On a side table, tucked almost behind a lamp, sat the single photo of me. A stiff high school graduation portrait with acne and a forced smile. Dinner that night was a play I'd already memorized. Mom had cooked every one of Audrey's favorites, including Swedish meatballs she rarely bothered with. The conversation circled Audrey's new promotion, her office with a window view, her team of 2 junior marketers. She gestured as though directing an orchestra while Mom and Dad chimed in like backup singers. "And how's your job, honey?" Mom finally asked, passing the cranberry sauce. "Still doing the spreadsheet thing?" I opened my mouth, but Audrey cut in with a laugh. She wouldn't know what to do with a promotion anyway. Remember, Gloria's always hated attention. I set my fork down carefully, pulse drumming in my ears. Michael caught my eye from across the table, his expression calm but steady, like a reminder. You don't have to shrink anymore. That night, the sleeping arrangements delivered the same message in different words. Audrey and her husband Brad got the master guest suite with the queen bed and private bath. Michael and I were directed to the pull-out sofa in the small guest room, the springs groaning, as if in protest. When I raised an eyebrow, Mom explained, "Well, Audrey has back problems, and you've always been less fussy. Besides, you're used to making do." Michael waited until the door closed before whispering, "Are they always like this?" I managed a tight smile. "This is them on good behavior, because of you." The next morning, the house smelled of turkey and sage. I padded down the hallway, intending to grab coffee, when voices from the kitchen stopped me cold. "I just don't understand why Gloria hasn't progressed more," Mom was saying. "She was always so good with numbers," Dad replied, "but she's never had Audrey's ambition." I heard Audrey's sigh, heavy with false pity. "I almost feel bad for her, and now she's brought this architect guy? I give it 6 months before he realizes she's not at his level." Their laughter, light, untroubled, landed like stones. I pressed my hand to the wall, the old yellow paint beneath my palm, steadying myself. The vow I'd made as a teenager throbbed back to life. One day they'll see me. Michael found me there, frozen. He didn't speak at first, just placed a hand on my shoulder. When I finally met his eyes, he said quietly, "Maybe it's time you stop hiding." Out in the crisp November air, I let the tears fall for the first time in years. The chill bit my cheeks, but Michael's hand was warm. "Nothing I do is ever enough," I whispered. He turned me to face him. "Maybe it's not about being enough for them. Maybe it's about being enough for yourself." But later that afternoon, when I stepped into the backyard to take a call, a client finalizing a multi-million-dollar deal, I forgot about caution. I spoke clearly, confidently, about returns and strategy. When I hung up, Audrey was standing by the door, eyes narrowed. "Since when do data analysts talk about 7-figure portfolios?" she asked, voice sharp as glass. I opened my mouth to answer, but Mom's call from the kitchen interrupted. Audrey didn't press, just gave me a long, calculating look before turning away, but her suspicion lingered, heavy as storm clouds. I knew then. The mask was slipping. By the time the Thanksgiving table was set, the air in the house was buzzing, brittle, like static before a storm. Mom laid out her embroidered leaf-pattern tablecloth, the one reserved for holidays, and the good china gleamed under the chandelier. The golden turkey sat in the center like a crowned monarch, flanked by bowls of mashed potatoes and glossy cranberry sauce. Everyone played their roles, Dad at the head, Mom at the foot, Audrey and Brad taking the prime seats, and Michael and me filling in the edges, as though proximity to the throne was still dictated by favoritism. The first 15 minutes went smoothly enough. Compliments about the turkey's tenderness, laughter about childhood stories that somehow always revolved around Audrey. Mom leaned forward, patting Audrey's hand as she said, "You'll have plenty of time for children, sweetheart, but oh, how lovely it would be to have grandchildren soon." Her eyes sparkled with expectation. No one looked at me, though I was the same age Audrey had been when she first moved in with Brad. It was as though my womb didn't exist, as though only Audrey's timeline mattered. Michael, ever the diplomat, chatted with Dad about architecture projects, walking him through the details of a museum renovation. I slipped away for a moment, heart pounding, to the car. The silver-wrapped television rested in the back seat like a secret. I carried it inside, leaning it carefully against the dining room wall. Mom noticed first. "What's that, honey?" An early Christmas present, I said, trying to sound casual. Thought you might like it for the football game after dinner. Her brows rose in surprise. Gloria, this must have cost a fortune. Dad frowned at the box. Over $1,000 easy. How can you afford something like this? My pulse quickened. For years, I'd hidden behind modest gifts, cookbooks, scarves, coffee mugs. This television was a leap, and already suspicion flickered in their eyes. I forced a small smile. I've been doing well at work. Audrey pushed back her chair and crouched beside the box, squinting at the label. Her phone was out in seconds, her fingers flying. $1,500, she announced, voice slicing through the chatter. That's more than a month's rent for some people. She turned, her gaze sharp. Since when can you afford gifts like this on a mid-level analyst salary? Silence fell. Forks paused midair. Gravy dripped from a spoon into a widening pool. Under the table, Michael's hand found my knee, steady. I inhaled slowly, then said, Actually, I'm not just an analyst. Audrey's eyes narrowed. What are you then? My mother's fork clattered against her plate. Gloria, what are you talking about? I opened my mouth, but Audrey was already scrolling, eyes darting across the screen. Her face drained of color, then flushed scarlet. Oh my God, she whispered, then louder. Oh my God. She slammed her phone onto the table, the sound sharp as glass shattering. Gloria Hart, CEO of TWW Strategic Partners, featured in Forbes 30 Under 30, managing over $200 million in assets. Net worth, she stopped, her voice trembling with rage. $15 million. The room froze. Dad's fork hovered in midair, his mouth slack. Mom reached blindly for her water glass, her hand trembling. Brad stared down at his plate as though it might offer escape. Audrey stood, fists clenched, her voice rising. All these years we've struggled, begged Mom and Dad for help with car loans, scraped together mortgage payments, and you were sitting on a fortune. $15 million, and you never said a word. Her anger filled the room like fire, licking at every corner. My heart pounded, but my voice, when it came, was steady. It wasn't about the money. Audrey's laugh was bitter, jagged. Then what was it about, Gloria? Pride? Punishing us? Watching us grovel while you hoarded your millions? I pushed back my chair and stood, my legs trembling, but firm. No, it was about survival. It was about being overlooked my entire life while you were celebrated for breathing. It was about working 3 jobs while you were handed tuition. It was about building something on my own because no one believed in me. For the first time in 32 years, their eyes were on me, really on me. And it was only the beginning. The silence after my words felt like the crackle before lightning. Audrey's face contorted, torn between disbelief and fury, her eyes gleaming like shards of broken glass. She jabbed a finger at me across the table. You're selfish, she hissed. Do you know what we could have done with that money? Brad and I have been saving for a house for years. Mom and Dad dipped into their retirement to help us cover bills. And all this time, you sat there with millions and said nothing. Brad shifted uncomfortably beside her, his fork scraping against porcelain. He looked like he wanted to shrink into the wallpaper. Mom's tears spilled silently, her napkin trembling in her hand. Dad hadn't spoken at all. He just stared at me like I was speaking a language he'd never heard before. Selfish, I repeated, my voice calm but sharp. I was invisible in this family. Do you remember my science fair at 12? You didn't come because Audrey had a dance recital. My certificate ended up in a drawer. Do you remember Christmas when Audrey got a sapphire necklace and I got books on scientists? Do you remember when I graduated valedictorian and you spent the party bragging about Audrey's college acceptance? Tell me, where was your generosity then? Where was the fairness? Mom gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad shifted in his chair, his eyes flickering with something I hadn't seen in years. Guilt. Audrey scoffed, her voice rising. That was childhood. This is different. This is about family obligation. You owe us. We've been helping each other all these years. And you've been hoarding... Michael's voice cut in, low but firm, carrying more weight than his volume suggested. From what I've seen, Gloria has been giving to this family her entire life. Just not financially. Maybe it's time someone gave her basic respect. Audrey whirled on him. Nobody asked you. I touched Michael's arm gently, stopping him from saying more. My voice, when it came, was steady, though I could feel the tremor in my chest. I don't owe anyone anything. The money I've made is mine, built from nothing but hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices no one here cared to notice. I will not apologize for succeeding where no one expected me to." Audrey's hands balled into fists at her sides. "This isn't about apologies, it's about fairness." "Fairness?" I let out a bitter laugh. Fairness would have been parents who saw me as more than the backup daughter. Fairness would have been splitting opportunities, love, attention. You were handed everything: support, praise, second chances. I clawed my way to the life I have, and now you want to call it selfish because I won't hand it to you. The turkey sat untouched, the cranberry sauce bleeding into the tablecloth. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate. "Michael and I will stay at a hotel tonight." Mom's voice cracked. "Gloria, please, don't leave like this." But I was already rising, my chair scraping against the hardwood. Michael stood with me, his hand brushing mine in solidarity. Audrey's voice followed us like a whip as we headed for the door. "This isn't over. You can't just walk away. You can't hide money from your family and pretend it's okay." The cool November air hit me like a blessing as we stepped outside. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because it had finally been named. Inside, the house that had never been home buzzed with shock and silence. And I knew this was only the beginning of the fallout. The Marriott hotel room felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of that dinner. Michael ordered room service, steak for him, pasta for me, while I sat on the edge of the bed, alternating between bursts of disbelieving laughter and long, shaky exhales. My phone buzzed over and over on the nightstand, screen lighting up with messages. Audrey's name in all caps, then Mom, then even Brad. I flipped it face down. I couldn't bring myself to look. "I can't believe that just happened," I said, for maybe the 10th time, my voice hoarse. "Did you see Dad's face? I've never seen him speechless in my life." Michael set a glass of wine in my hand. "You were magnificent," he said simply. "Calm, steady, while your sister had a tantrum over money that isn't even hers." I sipped, the wine warm against the hollow ache in my chest. It doesn't feel magnificent. It feels exhausting. That night, curled against him, I let the exhaustion wash over me. For the first time in decades, I had spoken my truth out loud, stripped of pretense. I fell asleep wondering if that truth had burned every bridge beyond repair. Morning came with a flood of notifications. Audrey had sent 17 text messages overnight, ping-ponging between fury and apology. "How dare you walk out on us? I'm sorry, I just lost it. We need to talk about how your money can help the family. Your silence is immature and selfish." Mom had left tearful voicemails begging me to come back so we could talk like a family. Brad sent a single awkward text. "Sorry about last night. I didn't know she'd react like that." Dad sent nothing. I was toweling my hair after a shower when a knock came at the door. Michael answered, and there stood my father, still in yesterday's clothes, his face drawn and sleepless. "I need to speak with my daughter," he said, his voice rough. Michael gave me a questioning glance, then slipped out quietly to get coffee. Dad stepped inside and sat heavily in the desk chair, staring at his hands. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Then, finally, 15 million. I still can't wrap my head around it. "It's not about the money, Dad," I said softly, pulling the robe tighter around me. He lifted his gaze, eyes rimmed red. "I know." His voice broke slightly. "It's about how we treated you. How we've always treated you." The words shocked me more than Audrey's meltdown had. I expected excuses, maybe even anger. But guilt? Admission? That was new. "I wasn't a good father to you," he said. "We told ourselves Audrey needed more attention, more support, more everything. You were quiet, capable. We thought that meant you needed less. But it wasn't fair. You deserve more than what we gave." I felt a lump rise in my throat, the same ache I'd swallowed for decades. "No," I whispered. "It wasn't fair." He rubbed his face with both hands, sighing deeply. "Do you remember the science competition when you were 10? That solar system model you built that actually moved? I was so proud, Gloria. But Audrey was restless, throwing a fit, so we left early. You stood there alone when they called your name. I've never forgiven myself for that." My eyes stung. I remembered every detail. The motor whirring, the ribbon in my hand, the empty space where my family should have been. "There have been 1,000 moments like that," I said, my voice low. 1,000 times when I wasn't enough to hold your attention. And now you're sorry because I'm successful. Would we be having this conversation if I was still invisible? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. My phone buzzed again. Mom. Dad glanced at the screen, then back at me. They're waiting at the house. Your mother, Audrey. They want to talk. All of us, as a family. I laughed bitterly. About my money. His silence was answer enough. When Michael returned with coffee, I told him. He studied my face carefully. Is it worth going back? I don't know, I admitted. But maybe I need to. Not for them, for me. To set boundaries once and for all. The drive back to my parents' house felt heavier than the one from New York. The television still sat in their living room, paper torn, box gaping like a wound. Mom rushed to hug me at the door, but I stepped back, holding up a hand. Let's just talk. Audrey stood behind her, arms crossed, her eyes swollen from crying, but her jaw set like iron. I want to apologize, she began, voice brittle, for how I reacted. It was a shock, finding out you've been sitting on millions while we've been struggling. I lashed out. But we're adults now. We should figure out how your money can help the family. Her words dripped with false contrition, her real intent shining through, entitlement. I stared at her for a long moment, then said evenly, I've watched you take family support your entire adult life. College tuition, car payments, vacations, even now. You expect them to subsidize you. I never asked for or received a dime. And now you think I owe you because I succeeded without help? That's different, Audrey snapped. They offered me help because they love me. And because I didn't need it, I don't deserve the same love? I asked. Mom's voice wavered. We love you both, Gloria. We just showed it differently. You didn't show it to me at all, I said flatly. The room went still. Even Dad couldn't meet my eyes. Audrey slammed her palm against the arm of the couch. Enough about the past. The question is, what are you going to do now? For us. For this family. Her words rang in the air like a demand. And for the first time in my life, I felt no need to appease her. The living room felt colder than the November air outside. Mom sat stiff on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisted together in her lap. Dad leaned back in his armchair, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of years had finally caught him. Audrey stood, pacing, her voice growing sharper with every word. You can't just keep all that money to yourself, she said, glaring at me as though I had committed a crime. Family shares. That's what families do. Michael shifted beside me, but I raised a hand, signaling I would handle this. Audrey, I said slowly, family also supports each other emotionally. They celebrate each other's victories. They treat their children equally. Did that ever happen here? She rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, we were kids. Why are you still hung up on that? This isn't about photo albums or Christmas presents. This is about the fact that you're worth $15 million and you've been keeping it a secret. Do you know how many problems that could solve? I felt heat rising in my chest, but my voice stayed calm. Whose problems? Yours? You've had help your whole life. Mom and Dad paid for your tuition, your car, even your vacations. When I asked for paint for my bedroom walls, they said we couldn't afford it. And now you want me to bankroll your lifestyle? That's not fair, Mom interrupted, her voice trembling. We didn't mean to make you feel less loved. You were always so capable, so independent. Audrey, she needed more. I was independent because I had no choice, I said, meeting her eyes. I was capable because no one else was going to step in. The words landed heavy in the room. Dad rubbed a hand over his face, as if trying to erase decades of choices. Audrey folded her arms, her jaw tight. So what? You're just going to hoard it all? While we struggle? Michael finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. What I've seen is that Gloria has been giving to this family her entire life, just not with money. She's given patience, forgiveness, and resilience, and all she's gotten in return is dismissal. Stay out of this, Audrey snapped at him. No, I said sharply, turning on her. Don't speak to him like that. This is between us, but he's seen it with his own eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mom wiped at her cheeks. Dad stared at the floor. Audrey's breathing was ragged, anger simmering beneath her skin. I stood, my voice steady now. I am not giving you money for a house, for a car, or for vacations. If Mom and Dad ever truly need something, medical bills, a roof over their heads, I will help. But I will not enable entitlement any longer. I will not erase decades of favoritism by writing you a check. Audrey's face flushed crimson. Then you're not my sister anymore. I swallowed hard, the words striking deeper than I wanted to admit. but I didn't flinch. Maybe I never really was. The air in the room fractured. Mom let out a broken sob. Dad closed his eyes. Michael's hand brushed mine, grounding me. I turned toward the door. We're done here. Gloria! Mom cried, reaching out, but I stepped back, keeping my distance. At the threshold, Dad's voice followed me, low and rough. I'm sorry for everything, for 32 years of getting it wrong. I paused, the ache in my chest almost unbearable, then nodded once. I know. And with that, Michael and I walked out into the cold, leaving the house and decades of silence behind. The drive back to New York was quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but thick with thoughts neither of us could quite put into words. The trees blurred past, bare branches clawing at a gray sky, and I felt like I was shedding something heavy, though it clung stubbornly at the edges. Michael finally broke the silence. You handled that with more grace than anyone else would have. Most people would have screamed or slammed doors. I gave a small laugh, though it sounded hollow. Screaming never worked in my house. Silence was the only weapon I had. Tonight, I think it finally cut deep enough to be heard. We crossed the state line, the lights of the city slowly blooming in the distance. For the first time, I wondered if I had burned the bridge for good, or if there had ever really been a bridge at all. The days after Thanksgiving were a blur of fallout. My phone lit up constantly. Mom called every morning, her voice trembling, sometimes apologetic, sometimes pleading. We love you, Gloria. We just didn't realize how you felt. Other times, she slipped back into old patterns. Your sister's hurting. Maybe if you helped her with a down payment, it would heal things. Dad was quieter. His calls were shorter, less frequent, but different, more thoughtful. I should have asked more questions, he admitted once. I should have seen you, not just assumed you'd be fine. I'm proud of you, not for the money, for what you built when we weren't looking. His words warmed something in me I didn't know was still alive. Audrey, on the other hand, flooded me with fury and guilt in equal measure. Long texts that swung from venom, you've ruined this family, to self-pity. Do you know how hard it's been for me? To entitlement? We need to talk about what's fair. You can't just keep it all to yourself. After a week, I stopped reading them. Michael gently suggested I block her, but I wasn't ready, not yet. What I did block were the messages from cousins and distant relatives who suddenly remembered I existed. Since you're obviously wealthy, my son needs help with tuition. Could you sponsor my kid's soccer camp? It would mean so much to the family if you chipped in for Aunt Carol's medical bills. People who hadn't called me in years, who had never once asked about my life, now lined up with their palms open. I stared at those messages until rage burned through the ache. They weren't asking for connection. They were asking for access. Access to the one thing I had built in silence, the one thing I hadn't needed them for. That was the week I found a therapist. Dr. Harrison had eyes that missed nothing and a voice like stone, polished smooth by water. She listened as I poured out the story of yellow walls, empty photo albums, quiet vows, and the Thanksgiving explosion. When I finished, she leaned forward. Your success shattered the roles your family had written for you. You were the self-sufficient one. Audrey was the needy one. Your parents were the providers. When you revealed your wealth, the entire system collapsed. And systems, Gloria, don't like to collapse. Her words lodged deep. It wasn't just about money. It was about the roles we had all been cast in, roles that suited everyone but me. Through therapy, I began to draw boundaries. I emailed my family a list, clear and simple. I will not discuss my finances. I will not provide funding for Audrey's lifestyle. I will only participate in gatherings where my achievements are acknowledged equally. The responses split like glass. Audrey erupted, sending a scathing message that ended with, "You're not my sister anymore. I blocked her that day," and the silence that followed felt like breathing clean air for the first time. My parents' responses were softer, messier. Mom wept over the phone, torn between apology and denial. Dad, though, surprised me. "I don't think I ever saw you clearly," he said one evening, "but I'm trying now, if you'll let me." I wasn't sure yet if I would, but for the first time I believed he meant it. 6 months after that Thanksgiving, spring seeped back into New York, the kind that warmed concrete slowly, that coaxed buds onto trees, like hesitant promises. By then, the raw edges of the fallout had begun to scar over. Not healed, not forgotten, but no longer bleeding with every thought. Audrey and I no longer spoke. Her final message, spat through text, still lingered in my phone's archive. "You've destroyed this family. Don't bother reaching out again." I hadn't. Blocking her brought a relief I hadn't expected. The silence was loud at first, but then it softened into peace. My parents remained in the picture, though the frame had shifted. Dad called every couple of weeks, asking questions he never would have before. "How's the firm? What's the project you're most proud of right now?" He listened, really listened, as though making up for decades of silence. Once he said quietly, "I always thought pride meant talking about Audrey's recitals, her promotions. I should have been bragging about you too," his voice cracked. "I missed it. I missed you." Mom struggled more. Old habits clung stubbornly. She still slipped Audrey into conversations, still hinted that maybe if I shared just a little, it might mend things. But even her edges were softening, her certainty fraying. "Once," she admitted, "I thought being practical meant you didn't need us. I see now I was wrong." It wasn't a full reckoning, but it was more than I'd ever had. I made one choice that surprised even me. I set up an educational trust for Audrey's children, my niece and nephew. Money they could use for college, structured so Audrey couldn't touch it. It wasn't about her, it was about them. Their futures didn't deserve to be collateral in our family's failures. When I told my parents, Dad's voice broke again. "That's incredibly generous, Gloria, especially after everything." But the real shift came not in them, but in me. I began mentoring young women in finance, the kind who walked into boardrooms full of men and felt small. I saw myself in them, tight smiles, hunched shoulders, brilliance folded inward. I gave them what Grandma Liz had given me: knowledge, faith, the blueprint for building something no one could take away. And when one of them texted me after landing her first major investment deal, "I couldn't have done this without you," I cried in a way I hadn't even at Thanksgiving. Because this, I realized, was what all those years of invisibility had forged in me, the determination to make others visible. Michael and I grew closer in the fallout's quiet. He'd seen me stripped bare, angry, wounded, defiant, and loved me through all of it. On a trip to the Berkshires that June, he slipped a vintage emerald ring onto my finger. "Do you think we'll have kids someday?" he asked that night, his voice muffled against my hair. I thought about Audrey, about the uneven scales of our childhood. "Yes," I whispered, "but if we do, we'll do better. We'll love each child for exactly who they are, not who needs us most." Lying there, the future unspooled in front of me, messy, imperfect, but mine. No more yellow walls, no more silence. Just a life I had built, step by step, choice by choice, until the weight of it could no longer be ignored. I had always been the girl in the shadow, but now I was the woman who had stepped into her own light. And that, I realized, was worth far more than $15 million. By the time the next Thanksgiving approached, I had stopped pretending I could go back to who I had been before. Once the secret was out, there was no way to shove it back into the dark. The double life I'd carried for years, one face for the world, another for my family, was over. And though the rupture had hurt, there was a strange, fierce freedom in it. I learned lessons I hadn't expected. Honesty, even when it burned, was easier than carrying lies. My fortune didn't change me. It only revealed who people around me already were. Those who valued me before still did. Those who suddenly reached for me with open palms proved they had only ever seen me as a resource waiting to be tapped. And perhaps most important, my worth had never been measured in recognition from the people who refused to see me. It had to come from within. That fall, I expanded my firm's philanthropic arm, channeling funds into organizations that supported young women in finance and technology. I sat on panels, spoke at conferences, and offered seed investments to women starting businesses with nothing but grit and a good idea. The joy in watching their sparks catch flame gave me something I'd never felt, even when signing my own largest deals: fulfillment. Meanwhile, family remained complicated. Dad kept calling, sometimes clumsy, sometimes tender. "I truly didn't understand what you were building," he admitted once. "I thought finance meant pushing papers in some cubicle. I'm sorry I never asked. I'm proud of you, Gloria." Those words, so simple, undid me more than any check he could have written. Mom wavered. She still brought up Audrey, still framed things as if I'd been too strong to need her. But there were cracks now, hesitations where certainty used to live. She was trying, in her way. I didn't know yet if it would ever be enough. Audrey stayed silent. The last thing she'd sent was a scathing message. You destroyed this family with your selfishness. I had blocked her, and the quiet that followed was both grief and relief. Grief for the sister I had wanted, but never truly had. Relief for the poison that no longer seeped into every conversation. Michael and I built something steadier together. The man who had watched me unravel in my parents' dining room was also the one who saw me as whole. When he proposed, emerald ring glinting in the Berkshire's moonlight, I said yes, not just to him, but to the idea of a future unchained from the past. A future where love didn't depend on performance or pretense. The most profound healing, though, came in realizing I could create my own family beyond blood. Friends who cheered my victories without resentment. Mentees who looked at me with the awe I had once reserved for Grandma Liz. Michael, who loved every jagged edge. That was my chosen family, the one that lifted me instead of weighing me down. When Thanksgiving finally arrived, Michael and I spent it in our Manhattan apartment with a handful of friends, laughter spilling out over candlelight and wine. No silent judgments, no favoritism, no old roles dragged out like dusty costumes, just warmth, just belonging. As I looked around the table, I realized something. I had always been the girl left in the shadows, but shadows only exist because there is light. And after 32 years, I had finally stepped fully into mine.